You found the skeleton. How would you calculate that? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, it's me, the Dapper Dino, back again to keep debunking Dan Biddle. When last we left off, Dan was busy pretending that Lucy was the only hominin ever found. Turns out, he's still doing that. So sit back, grab a drink, a snack, settle in, and give this video a like as we see what other nonsense Dan has for us.
This is Donald Johanson, the discoverer of Lucy, talking about how many different Lucy specimens they've found.
Only one Lucy has been found, because that's the nickname for a single specimen. What he's about to talk about is how many specimens of Australopithecus afarensis have been found. The species is not interchangeable with the name of a particular specimen. And this would be like calling all of humanity Teresa because you know one human by that name.
We now have 400 specimens of Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, named after the Afar region. And we know that there are very large individuals, which were males, and the smaller ones are certainly females.
What Donald Johanson says on this BBC video is he says we now have 400 specimens of Lucy's kind, and we know which ones are male and which ones are female. So he says 400 specimens of Lucy's kind. And while he's saying that, they have hundreds and hundreds of upright, complete skeleton fossils parading across the screen.
Yes, because the public likes reconstructions, and provided they are not inaccurate, there is nothing wrong with reconstructions. And since we have basically every bone of the species to draw from, we can make accurate reconstructions.
What he's not telling the audience, what he means by 400 specimens of Lucy's kind, is this picnic table.
Except that picture is taken from Dr. Johansson's own lectures, so he is telling people in it. Just not in that one cherry-picked clip. Which, by the way, I'm very confident Johnson didn't animate.
That's the specimens he's talking about. They show these. They say we now have 400 specimens of Lucy's kind while all these things are parading across the screen, but they actually only have 380 bone pieces. They think the other 20 are in a private collection somewhere, and 35% of that collection is just teeth.
Teeth are pretty important in mammals, especially. But I'm waiting for a point here. Each new specimen gives us more data, no matter how small the specimen is. If you find the proximal end of a tibia, that still gives you data about the Australopithecus tibia. If you find a few foot bones, that still gives you information about Australopithecus feet.
You can take the whole thing. Here's Lucy down here. Here's all Lucy's supposed friends. You can take the whole lot of it and put it in a 5-gallon Home Depot bucket. That's their evidence.
You know what no paleontologist has ever found significant about a collection of specimens? Their total volume. I cannot express in strong enough language how stupid it is to give you the approximate volume of a bunch of fossils as if that says anything about the quality of the science.
Okay, moving on from that.
Really? And then he just moves on without even trying to make a point? How does anyone take this man seriously?
But when you see Lucy, they added hands and fingers. They've given her eye whites. In Japan, they actually took her fur off. We had to put a bikini on her there. You know, she's got a little kid and a husband now.
Well, as Dan himself pointed out, we have a lot of hand and foot bones. In fact, Dan even thinks the conclusions about the hands are solid enough to pretend that they are a problem for evolution. So again, we have that double standard that we saw in the last episode. But yes, reconstructions vary in the areas where the skeleton can't give us information, like amount of body hair or eye coloration.
And look at these eye whites, and now we've got Lucy in deep thought, and she's got completely human-like hands and fingers. They didn't find Lucy's hands, they didn't find her fingers, they didn't find her feet, but they've given her hands and feet in museums.
No, but they did find them in other specimens, so...
Very interesting. So let's look at the next pillar as we continue to tour through here.
Okay, I guess we're done with human evolution. The only species that matters to the story is apparently Australopithecus afarensis, and only one specimen of that species is important. So, who cares about Australopithecus africanus, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo luzonensis, etc.? So, even if everything Dan said were true and indicative of Lucy not being a hominin, but instead some kind of chimpanzee, it wouldn't actually do anything to assail the rest of the evidence for human evolution, which would still be a strong conclusion from the remaining evidence. This has got to be one of the weakest attempts to refute the science of human origins that I've ever seen.
Pillars 3 and 4, which are adaptation and natural selection and mutations. These are the other pillars that you'll find in high school books.
So at least this time it's reasonable to call these pillars of evolution. Mutation, natural selection, and adaptation are all core parts of the theory, not just examples of it in action like human evolution is.
The Bible says, let these creatures reproduce after their kind. The Hebrew word is mean. And we know that animals create after their kind because the reproductive systems are locked to within seeds of their own kind. You never see a raccoon successfully breed with a cat or a cat with a dog. Animals are locked to within their kind by the reproductive system that God's assigned.
Which is also what we expect from evolution, because this kind of reproductive isolation is exactly what we would expect given speciation events, and speciation is basically the increase in biodiversity that evolution predicts.
And we've never seen a new kind emerge. And we have 4,000 to 5,000 years of recorded history. No one's ever watched evolution happen. We've never seen a new kind emerge.
Who wants to take bets on whether or not Dan gives us a definition for kind that is actually useful in determining if anything ever evolved into a new kind?
Well, this is one of the most famous contributions that Charles Darwin made. In the 1830s, he goes to the Galapagos Islands and he says, look at that, I've just formed clinched the case for evolution because I see finch beaks changing. I go to one island, I see some birds have short stubby beaks. I go to another island and they have long skinny beaks. Therefore, case closed, evolution is happening because if you take those little variations and changes and slap on millions of years, you could have that bird turn into something else, some other creature.
We've also never seen a new Glorgits emerge from the Frumplude either. Primarily because, those things don't have a definition, so we have no way of knowing if they emerged. Similarly, no one can say what a new kind emerging would even look like, since we can't identify kinds in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Dan here has never read Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, because the finches were cited as an example that led to his idea, not some conclusive proof of it. Darwin's case was built up by looking at many examples of both natural and artificial selection and did not hinge on any one group of organisms.
That's what they believed. But now what have we learned since that discovery in 1835? We've thrown lots of science into looking at bird finch beaks. And what we've discovered is that these Swedish scientists here followed 1,000 finches in a suburban and an urban environment. And they have now scientifically demonstrated that finches within a single generation can adapt their beak width and length based upon their food sources.
This is an example of what's called phenotypic plasticity, wherein a single genotype can result in more than one phenotype because of processes like muscle development, availability of nutrients, and yes, epigenetic changes. But that doesn't mean that changes in genotype don't occur. We can watch them occur both in the lab and the wild. The existence of phenotypic plasticity doesn't do anything to change the fact that genomes change over time.
And they've also learned at a chemical molecular level, it has nothing to do with evolution. It has to do with these creatures varying with what's called epigenetics.
Before we continue, I just want to point out that epigenetics is an evolutionary mechanism. It's not something that contradicts evolution, and also the degree to which portions of the genome can be affected epigenetically can itself evolve.
There are these little things called methyl tags that activate different gene expressions within the pre-existing code that God made to have in these finches so that they would vary based upon their food sources.
Ignoring the unwarranted attribution of cause to a divine agent, yeah, that's how epigenetics works. Genes which are not needed can be methylated so that they are less likely to be expressed, allowing other genes to be dominant, causing a change in morphology or chemistry. But I really am curious how Biddle is going to go ahead and turn this into, therefore the genome can't undergo selection due to pressures in the environment.
So what Darwin thought as evolution was actually God's amazing intelligent design, because he programmed into these creatures, hey, if you live on an island where you got to crack small hard nuts, you're going to need short little stumpy beaks for that. And if you're going to go plucking worms out of the beach that are trying to come up, you're going to need a long skinny beak. Now, they'll never turn into anything but finches, but they can vary within limits, and it can happen within a single generation.
Well, that's just the law of monophyly that says that finches, or more properly in this case, tanagers, thanks to Jackson Wheat for that bit of trivia, will never be not tanagers no matter how much they change. Let's say one of your ancestors is Genghis Khan, because if you're human, there's like a 1% chance he's your ancestor. Now let's say that 100 years from now, one of your descendants is born. Naturally, Genghis Khan will also be that kid's ancestor. So let's say that 1,000 years after that, that kid's descendant is born. And guess what? This new kid will still be a descendant of Genghis Khan. We can push it out to 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000. No number of generations can erase your ancestry. So no number of generations or amount of morphological change will allow a tanager descendant to ever be not a tanager.
But it gets better. Evolutionists used to go around beating up creationists all the time with blind cave fish. They would say, look at that, we can prove evolution because you take these little fish and then they evolve their eyes away because their eyes would be disadvantageous because they go into a little dark cave and they're bumping their eyes against a wall all the time and they get infections, and so they just evolve their eyes away. But do you know what happens when you take these same blind cave fish, take them out of the cave and put them into a setting with light? They grow their eyes back in 1 generation.
I can't decide if that's dumb or if he's lying. Read the article yourself if you want, it's linked in the description. These fish are Mexican cavefish of the species Astyanax mexicanus, and they live in multiple isolated caves throughout northern Mexico. This study was to see if all the populations that are blind for the same genetic reasons. You see, regardless of light levels, when you take a fish from a single cave and breed them in captivity, they always produce blind offspring. But if they were all blind for the same genetic cause, then breeding fish from different caves would also produce blind fish. However, if it were different genetic mechanisms causing blindness, then the fact that all the genes necessary for functioning eyes would exist between the two populations would mean that when you hybridize them, you should expect fish with eyes to be produced. In fact, this was the case. Only by hybridizing can these fish with eyes be born, and that is not dependent on light level.
So again, epigenetics toggling genes on or off so that animals could do what? Spread and multiply and fill the earth just like God said.
Except this isn't an epigenetic phenomenon, because it is not contingent on the environment, but entirely on ancestry. The broken genes weren't toggled on, they were paired with functional genes on both parent sides that together meant that a full set of functioning genes for eye development were present.
It's the same thing with mice. This came out in a journal called Evolution. Mice, within 1 or 2 generations, can grow 2 things: longer tails and, get this, extra vertebrae if they're living in trees.
This is the same thing again. This is not epigenetic, as the single generation changes only resulted from hybridization of different subspecies of the mouse Paromyscus maniculatus. So the change is entirely dependent on genetics and not on environment within a single generation. That means that the long and short-tailed populations genetically evolved different tail morphology as evidenced in this study, which is linked below. It was also determined that the long-tailed mice did not form a clade, and the hybridization also supported this in that the genetic mechanisms for long tails were different in different long-tailed populations. Further, the word epigenetics occurs 0 times in this entire paper. Weird for a paper that supposedly concludes that these changes are epigenetic.
How do they know to do that? They're not doing that themselves. It's all pre-programmed, and they've actually proven here, this is technical speak, but they say longer tails have evolved repeatedly in forested habitat. Variation in these traits is controlled by a separate gene loci. So it's not evolution, it's gene expressions being turned on or off.
That's not what that phrase means. It means that different locations on the genomes control this variation between populations of mice. The difference is genetic according to that statement, not epigenetic. Dan here just read off a statement that contradicts him and claims it supports him. Maybe he's just that stupid, but we know he's been dishonest in the past, so who knows?
Pillars 5 and 6 of fossils and common ancestors. We know there's lots of fossils around the world. This is from FossilWorks database. All these little dots are fossil findings that are found all over the world. Here's a mid-Atlantic ridge system that we talked about last night. All of these big black lines here, this is the oceanic rift system that God broke open in Genesis 7:11 when all the fountains of the great deep broke open. It covers the earth 1.9 times over. These are the fountains of the great deep that broke open, and when that happened,
the entire earth was vaporized into a plasma where not just biology, but even chemistry breaks down. Because that's the kind of heat we're talking about according to both catastrophic plate tectonics and hydroplate theory, the only 2 flood models I'm aware of in flood geology literature.
it sent tsunamis up onto the land in a repeating, cycling way that buried them in stratified layers.
Except that we know how to recognize tsunamite, which is the kind of rock left behind by a tsunami, and virtually none of the fossil record is in such deposits.
That's why we see the marine life buried first, followed by some land creatures, followed up by reptiles and mammals, and then finally man.
Okay, so why are flying creatures found with some only in lower strata like pterosaurs, but birds can be found all the way to the top? Why didn't the pterosaurs and birds all get buried together in the top layers? Why are the marine deposits in the top layers full of fossils of whales? Why aren't they with the trilobites? Why is it that once terrestrial creatures appear, we find them with aquatic creatures at the same levels of the geologic strata all throughout? If it were true that the terrestrial deposits were restricted to the upper strata, this would make sense, but it's not true. This ecological zonation doesn't bear even the most cursory examination.
The fossil order that's used to pitch evolution in school textbooks like this, they say, well, we evolved from these simple little creatures and then moved up and moved up and moved up. That data does not prove evolution, it proves a fossil burial record from Noah's flood.
Except it's sorted exactly the way the flood wouldn't sort it, and exactly the way evolution would.
And that's exactly what we see because the ocean life was buried first, amphibians and reptiles could run for it, mammals, birds, and finally humans.
I would like to introduce you all to Paleobatrachus, a genus of frogs that lived in Europe from possibly the late Cretaceous all the way to the Middle Pleistocene, long after humans appear in the fossil record for the first time. Why did they manage to hop their way to where the humans were, while other frogs, like Triadobatrachus, got stuck in the early Triassic? Now let's look at Geosternbergia sternbergi. This magnificent beast flew around during the late Cretaceous, and this is Apiornis maximus, a bird that lived well into the period of human fossil remains. Apiornis was flightless and barely even had wings. So why did it manage to run up the hills to safety with the humans, while the flying pterosaur couldn't make it to high ground any faster than a lumbering ankylosaurus? I don't think Dan has any answers to this.
People say, well, why don't we find a lot of human fossils? Because
I mean, we do find a lot of human fossils, but we should be finding them all over the place if a flood occurred.
humans are smart. They could run for it. They could build makeshift rafts. They're going to go to the highest hills. They're going to try to last as long as they could because it took 150 days before the flood zenith.
In 2004, an earthquake in the Indian Ocean caused a series of tsunamis all across the ocean's coastlines. More than 53,000 people died in a single tsunami. But Dan here seems to think that humans can easily escape numerous and repeated even taller tsunamis because they're smart. Well, apparently they can't just run away from a tsunami fast enough, so this doesn't do anything to explain why we don't see humans with the first terrestrial fossiliferous deposits. Humans like to live on the coast, and if they were living on the coast with a bunch of carboniferous griffinflies and parareptiles, they wouldn't have escaped, and they too would have been buried in those deposits.
So those guys had 5 months to run around and scamper and try to survive during a cataclysmic flood.
Yeah, the people already living on high ground probably would have sought even higher ground. But what about the people who were killed in the first and second tsunamis, who wouldn't have time to run for the hills? But just for fun, let's look at some more animals that don't fit the idea of ecological zonation. Meet Cartorhynchus, an adorable ichthyosaur from the early Triassic. It lived in the ocean. Why don't we find it with trilobites? Meet also Leviathan, a sperm whale that lived up to the Pliocene, some of the top layers of the geological column. How come we don't find it with Cartorhynchus, but instead in layers of the same age as the ones where we find birds and terrestrial mammals?
So even Charles Darwin said, by his theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in the countless number in the crust of the earth? And he goes on to say, assuredly, geology does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. It's the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory.
But we know of lots of them. Let's take a look at a few, shall we?
Well, we've been digging for over 150 years more, and we see more stasis, which is static creature. When creatures show up in the fossil record, yeah, there's some changes that happen here or there, but creatures are living out.
Yes, stasis is more common than observable change, but we do observe change. In fact, by saying stasis is more common, Dan implies that change also occurs. But nothing about evolution demands that all lineages be undergoing gross morphological change constantly through time,
as they were designed to live out. So evolution would say about bats that bats supposedly would start out like a little rat creature and then somehow grow some advantageous features to get some wings that would grow on. So you've got this rat eventually evolving into a bat with lots of brats in the in-between.
Well, it certainly wasn't a rat, since bats are not closely related to rodents. In fact, Biddle is more closely related to a rat than a bat is, and by quite a lot, too.
So that's what evolution would say. But you know, when we go collect bats and bat fossils and you look at them in museums, they've collected over 1,000 bats. How many of these things do you think they've found? None. They don't have any. So we should have lots of pre-bats, but they've found 0 pre-bats.
Should we have lots of pre-bats, though? You see, the first bats were probably arboreal forest dwellers, and forests are well known for leaving behind essentially no animal fossils. And the fact that you can pick lineages with obscure fossil origins doesn't erase the other lineages for which we have an excellent fossil record, like Sirenians, Proboscideans, Carnivorians, Hominids, Neoceratopsians, Coccolithophores, Chelicerates, etc.
What about turtles? Well, we've got 100,000 turtles that are displayed in museums. How many pre-turtles do you think they've found?
Depending on what you mean, we have dozens of stem turtles in the fossil record, including some that are transitional between the basal pantastudines and modern turtles, like Eunotosaurus, Papochelys, Odontochelys, and Proganochelys.
0 pre-turtles. When you find a turtle in the fossil record, it always just shows up as a turtle.
So what's Odontochelys, which has a plastron but no carapace? It's not a full turtle since it doesn't have a full turtle shell, but it's got half a turtle shell. Seems like a perfect transitional turtle to me.
It goes on with dinosaurs, pterosaurs, sea lions, seals. This guy, Carl Werner, he went through 60 different museums for 10 years, taking pictures of all this stuff and interviewing people. The transitional forms just don't exist.
Well, we've already seen quite a few examples of them, so they do exist.
They think they have 2. They've got Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik.
We have way more than 2, but those 2 are cool transitional forms. But I think we'll call that for the day. Tune in next time for more discussions of evolutionary transitions, both extinct and extant. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please hit like. If you didn't, hit dislike and tell me in the comments what you didn't like about it. Either way, I do hope you subscribed if you haven't already, and make sure to turn on the bell and hit all notifications so you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Patrick Dennis, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos, and if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked to the description. And if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.